21 years ago today, November 15th, 1990, Rhode Islanders were first beginning to realize that all was not well at a bank called Heritage Loan and Investment in Providence. Residents probably couldn't even imagine that those problems would lead to the shutdown of 45 banks and credit unions several months later. But it all began on this day, as we see now on Flashback. The state auditors were hard at work this day inside Heritage, going through the mess that passed for the records at Joe Mollicone's bank. Mollicone had blown town a day or so earlier, allegedly with a lot of money from the bank. And our reporter Jim Terracani was finding out just how slipshod the bank's record-keeping was this day.
Examiners have isolated 120 loan documents, either applications or notes, that were questionable. Some people who had signed the loan notes were contacted and proved they never had such a loan. Peter Navola, RISDIC's executive director, when asked if Joseph Mollicone, the former bank president, forged the notes, said, quote, "He may very well have."
Did he embezzle funds?
I suspect yes.
Of course, the Deposit Insurance Corporation, RISDIC, headed by Navola, collapsed a month and a half later. And for 2 years, 300,000 Rhode Islanders were separated from their savings until the state bailout. Flashing back to another November 15th, 1969. Protesters at the Rhode Island State House telling passers-by, don't buy grapes from California. There were a lot of demonstrations in the 60s like this one, protesting the way the big corporations exploited migrant workers who were picking grapes. The protests got a lot of attention. Unfortunately, the plight of the migrant workers hasn't improved all that much, even to this day. Those protests were spin-offs of what I think Cesar Chavez was doing in California in that era. As for the 1990 story, as you probably know, Mollicone was eventually brought to justice and served 10 years in prison. Depositors at the RISDIC institutions got most of their money back a few years later by the end of 1992, sooner in some cases when healthy banks took over the ailing RISDIC banks and credit unions. The sickest of the RISDIC institutions, however, never reopened. And some people who had more than $100,000 in these institutions didn't get their money back over the $100,000. That was the FDIC limit and the NCUA limit back in those days. So the state officials followed that guideline in terms of getting money back to people.
And people are still sick over this to this day. You bring it up, it's a bad word.
Well, sure. Home purchases had to be canceled. Businesses had to close. There were all kinds of ramifications back there in the 90s. By the way, you probably recognize the voice of Jim Terracani doing that Mollicone story in 1990.